friends, it's Hannah and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be more of a reading wrap-up style video. You guys, it is officially April. We have moved past another quarter at this point, and I read a lot of books in the first quarter of 2024. Normally I do a monthly reading wrap-up, but I felt like it was very fitting to kind of go through some reading statistics and kind of update you guys on some of the books that I really liked, some that have honorable mentions, and just some other like overall reading statistics from the last quarter. It's been a really great quarter in terms of reading. For me, it's been probably the most I've read in a really long time. So I've got my laptop here and we're kind of gonna go through some of the overall updates that I have from the first quarter. So to kick it off, in total I have read 27 books, which feels like a lot. My goal for this year was 80. So to hit 27 in the first quarter is a really big push to reach my overall goal. Definitely feel like I'm going to exceed my goal this year, which is super exciting. So I've read a total of 27 books. In terms of total pages read, I have read 10,336 pages. And overall I've read a good mix of different types of genres. So I've read 1 chick lit, 1 classic, 4 fantasy, 3 fiction, 2 historical fiction, 3 literary fiction, 1 mystery, 1 nonfiction, 4 romance, 2 sci-fi, and 5 thrillers. So you can definitely tell that I'm leaning more towards fantasy, romance, and thrillers as the overall books that I've read the most over the last quarter. And just to give you kind of like a perspective on like where my ratings stand, I had 2 books that I rated 2 stars. I had 6 books that I rated 3 stars. I had 11 books that I rated 4 stars, and then I had a total of 8 books that I rated 5 stars. So I still feel like I am trying to figure out my overall preferences and tastes when it comes to genres, writing styles, different types of tropes that I really gravitate towards. So that's kind of why you'll see so many books rated as 5 stars. There's a couple that were like on the cusp of being 5 stars that I want to include in today's honorable mentions. But overall, like 5 stars to me are books that leave me with that feeling that they'll stay with me for the rest of my life. These are going to be books that I will potentially recommend to my friends. These are books that will come up in conversations casually with people. Overall lasting impact that it's had on me, both emotionally and just one that I can't stop thinking about, either the storyline or the characters, things like that. So that's kind of like a holistic view of what I've read over the last 3 months. My best reading month by far was January. I read over 4,000 pages. And I believe I read 11 books in the month of January, which is fantastic. That was definitely the month that I read the most by far. So with that being said, let's kind of go through a couple of like key highlights from the last quarter. So in terms of like the longest books I've read, the longest book I read was To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. And this is a sci-fi book. It is very different than what he's written in the past. If you're familiar with this author, he is well known for the Aragon series, which is about like these dragon riders. It was super popular in the early 2000s. He wrote that series. I think he wrote the first book when he was like 18 or 19 years old, which is incredible considering all of those books are over like 600 pages. So To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is a sci-fi book. It is about this girl who basically encounters alien life, and then just the impact that that has on her life as she is navigating personal relationships, how that impacts her, herself, her job, her career, what that means for the galaxy that she lives in. So it's really fascinating. There are multiple points where our main character, she has to band together with some unlikely characters, which is really fascinating to me. It's almost like this quest that they are put on to basically save the galaxy. So it's really good. It's very plot driven. It is super fast paced. It almost feels like a thriller in that regard because of the pacing of it is just so fast. The world building is phenomenal. There are charts and graphs and also like a glossary legend, if you will, that are part of the book, which help kind of clarify some of the more tricky points if you're not used to like a fantasy book. Sometimes fantasy books have maps, while sci-fi is very different. It's a little bit more conceptual, so I really appreciate the fact that that's included in the book. I read this on my Kindle. I do want to end up purchasing this and kind of adding it to my bookshelf in my collection. There's going to be additional books that come out in this series. This was published in 2020, so I believe he's working on a few others over the course of the series. Really enjoyed it. I ended up rating this one 5 stars. The other longest book that I read was Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Fairy Tale is a fantasy book by Stephen King. Most people, when they think of Stephen King, they think of horror novels. Well, Fairy Tale is a classic fantasy book. We are following our main character, Charlie, and he ends up taking care of his neighbor who's kind of going through some health issues. Well, Charlie ends up inheriting this person's house after he passes away, and it leads down this really long quest where he finds another portal to a different realm, like underneath the shed in the guy's backyard. So he goes through travel through there into this new fantasy world. He has greatness basically thrust upon him. He's having to rise to the occasion to save an entire country. It's got everything, you guys. It's got romance, it's got animal companionship, it has a quest, it has wars and battles and monsters. It's basically got it all. It is a fantastic book. I ended up rating this 4 stars, and it's a total of 601 pages. I really want to read more Stephen King. I think, you know, this was a really good book to kind of dip my toe into Stephen King without getting the whole like horror element that he's known for. So I'm really glad that I read that book. In terms of like some shorter books that I read, there were 2 books that were 256 pages. The first was The Day the World Came to Town by Jim DeFed, I want to say. This is a nonfiction book. It's about this town in Canada during 9/11. So for those of you who've kind of lived through 9/11, there was this period of time where when the Twin Towers were hit, all of these other planes that were traveling through airspace were required to land immediately at the closest airport possible. So for a lot of those planes that were coming over from Europe to New York, they were no longer, able to land in New York due to everything that was happening. So they were routed to this tiny little town in Canada, in Newfoundland, Canada, basically. So all of these planes show up there, thousands and thousands of people, the crews, all of the passengers, and this tiny little town basically takes in all of these passengers and cares for them for a couple of days actually before they're able to fly back home and get where they need to be. This is such a heartwarming tale. I gave this 5 stars. It was beautiful. The author himself ends up interviewing a lot of the passengers that have kind of gone through some really unique circumstances as a result of being forced to land in Gander, Newfoundland. And it's just so beautiful. It's very touching. I cried a lot throughout this book just because some of the stories were just unbelievable. So definitely would recommend that. There's also a play about this book. Definitely need to check that out. I have not seen the play yet, but definitely would be interested in that now. The second book that I read that was 256 pages was Beowulf, and this is a classic story. It is written in Old English, actually. And there's not really an author associated with this because it is a oral story that has been passed down through tradition and is a little bit of a legend. There is a rendition or edition by Seamus Heaney, I believe is how you say his name, and he also narrates the audiobook. So I listened to this on audiobook while I was doing some chores around my house, and I really like this book. I gave it 4 stars. It kind of feels like you're sitting at a campfire listening to the story unfold. It is about Beowulf, who is a warrior, and he has to slay this monster that is attacking his village, his town. He slays the monster, and then as a result of that, there is the monster's mother, Grendel, I believe is how you say her name. Grendel comes back for revenge because her son has been murdered by Beowulf. Beowulf has to band together with another town to ensure that he has the resources that he needs to take on Grendel and therefore secure the safety of the town. So it's a really good book. It is quite the legend. There's a lot of stories that have stemmed from this in the modern day due to just the action that it involves. It is such a classic legend. So yeah, I really liked the audiobook, definitely would recommend, and gave it 4 stars. All right, so now we will move into our 2-star reads. So I ended up rating 2 books that were 2 stars over the course of the first quarter, and I have them with me, so give me 1 second. So the first book that I read and rated 2 stars was How to Find Love in a Bookshop by Veronica Henry. This is a little bit more of like a literary fiction style writing. So Veronica Henry is actually a screenplay writer, I want to say, is like her first vocation. And the book kind of reads a little bit like that. It's very character driven. There's a lot of dialogue between characters. We get multiple different perspectives throughout this book. And the title is a little bit misleading, and also the cover as well. When I first picked this up, I thought this was going to be a romance about 2 people who fall in love in a bookstore, and it was going to be centered basically around these 2 people. And I was very wrong. This book is centered kind of around this bookstore set in this town in England. And the bookstore is failing. It's not doing well. The lady who owns the bookstore loses her father, so there's just this general theme of loss as the town is, rallied around her and this bookstore to kind of help it keep going. There's some financial difficulties that the bookstore owner kind of goes through. So it's focused more on the loss of her father and the impact that that has on the community. And yeah, I didn't really like it too much. I really felt like if I had different expectations going into this, maybe I would have rated it a little bit differently. I really didn't enjoy the overall dialogue because it does read like a screenplay at times. So I just feel a little bit let down after reading this book, which, it's not for me. The second book that I rated 2 stars was Ready or Not by Kara Bastian. So this is a romance story. It's a contemporary romance story set in New York. The main character, she is actually pregnant. So I think this is a trope that I don't really like in romance stories. I'm glad that I give it a try. I have not read a romance book where the main character was going through pregnancy, so I figured that, I would at least read it and see if it was something that I'd be into or not. I'm not really into it. So, our main character, she goes through a surprise pregnancy. Her name is Eve, and Eve is trying to figure out what to do. Does she, contact the father? Does she keep the baby? There's that whole aspect of it, but then there's also it's a romance book. So I thought she was gonna fall in love with the baby daddy. Not really. There's another side character who is kind of like a friend. So it's a slow burn friendship to lovers situation. I really thought there was gonna be more plot around the pregnancy and how she was going to handle that and how that was going to impact her as becoming a new mom and what that meant for her love life. But not really. There's some scenes in here where things become, that they fall in love, guys. So there's some, fall in love scenes, if you will, in this book. And I was very surprised that whole pregnancy situation that she's in didn't really play into that. I don't know. I think I was just let down. Also, the writing was just not my favorite. The overall writing style has a lot of dialogue, but the dialogue is like miscommunication between characters, which I don't really like that as a narrative or a theme within my romance story. So I think overall this was a really good learning experience. I know now that I do not like this type of trope in my romance stories, and there we go. I learned something from this. All right, so now the fun part, we get to go through our 5-star reads, and there were a total of 8 of them throughout the course of this first quarter. I cannot wait to get through these 5-star reads with you guys. So the first one is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, and oh my gosh, this is a fantastic sci-fi, it's like a sci-fi thriller romance mashup. And it is amazing. Blake Crouch has done a great job researching the background on parallel universes and different, quantum theory, sciencey stuff. It's the best way I can describe it. But so we're following a scientist, and he is walking home one day and ends up getting kidnapped. He gets knocked out throughout the course of this kidnapping, and then when he wakes up, his wife is no longer his wife. His son basically never existed. The job he had isn't really real anymore, and he's thrown into a completely different situation. It's like his old life never even existed. So it's amazing. That's all I have to say about that. I don't want to reveal too much because it is like so good. There has to be like a movie or a TV series about this somewhere, hopefully one day. The next one was To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. I also rated that as 5 stars by Christopher Paolini. The next is The Last Word by Taylor Adams. This is a thriller. So this is an interesting thriller. It's a cat and mouse chase. We're following our main character who she lives alone with her dog in this house that's very remote, which is a great setup for a thriller, let's just say that. And she is reading this book, rates this book as a 1 star. It's a horror novel, and then this author comes at her. He seeks her out, he stalks her, he tries to find her, he's seeking revenge, and I was obsessed with this book. Could not put it down. I think I finished it in like a day or 2 days. It was so good. Cat and mouse chase, that is a very good trope that I need to explore more of. The next book that I read that was 5 stars is The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. This was a Goodreads nomination for best new release fiction or best new author? Maybe it was both, if I remember correctly. We were following this teacher, and she is really connected to one of her students. She's like a teacher's aide or special aide. She feels really super connected to her one student who's going through a really difficult time, and she and the student have something in common. They really enjoy the same book series, and so they read these types of books together. So this author ends up coming out of retirement or hiding, and he holds this competition, and the teacher, she ends up being involved in the competition and going to the author's private island. And I think, if I remember correctly, the winner of the competition ends up winning a book, and the teacher really wants to win this competition because she's hoping to use the funds to adopt her student. And you guys, if that just doesn't make for a charming and heartwarming read, then I don't know what will. It was so cute. I cried so much throughout this book just because of how heartwarming and endearing it was. So for that reason, I end up giving it 5 stars. It's a really quick read. Like I said, it's less than 300 pages. So definitely would recommend this book for sure. The next 5-star read I have is Paris is Always a Good Idea, and I actually own this one. This is by Jen McKinley. She is known for being more of like a chick lit romance writer. So in this story, we are following our main character, Chelsea. And Chelsea is kind of encountering a midlife crisis in her 20s, so I guess quarter-life crisis. She's a bit of a workaholic, and her father ends up remarrying, or is going to remarry. He goes through an engagement, super quick engagement, and it kind of throws her for a loop. Chelsea is worried that she is headed down a path where all she does with her life is work, and doesn't end up finding the great romance of her life. She's going through some heartbreak and loss with the passing of her mom. So it kind of throws her for a loop, and she doesn't really know what to do. So her sister recommends that she goes back to Europe. Chelsea did a study abroad excursion year in Europe and encountered 3 different men that she fell in love with for 3 different reasons. So she's hoping to kind of go back and rekindle a old flame and see if maybe one of these 3 men, you know, maybe one of them was her soulmate and she's missing out on the great love story of her life. So she ends up flying across Europe and encountering all three of these different men, and it's a really good book. It's a little bit like Eat, Pray, Love, without the eating and the praying part. It's just about the love part. And I really liked it. I ended up crying, I ended up laughing. This book was really charming. It was a great read. The character, you know, Chelsea, she goes through development, she goes through growth as she's reunited with her family. It has it all. It's a really great read. So for that reason, I gave it 5 stars. The next one that I have is The Day the World Came to Town, which we already talked about. That is a fantastic 5-star read. It is a nonfiction story. The next one is The Housemaid's Secret, which is book number 2 in the Housemaid series by Freida McFadden. And this is a thriller mystery story. We are picking up right after the first book. If you've read that one, we're kind of following this housemaid. Her name is Millie, and Millie is once again put in a very awkward and precarious situation. She's having to basically work for this family that is very wealthy in New York City. She is cleaning for them and cooking for them, and there's definitely something that is off with this couple, with this family. So she gets involved a little bit more than maybe she should, and we are following all of these really messed up characters after that. There's a lot of really interesting situations that we get some background information to as the story unfolds. There's multiple perspectives. It is, Freida McFadden is just known for giving you those plot twists, those loops that you just didn't see coming. I love that in a thriller mystery. Like I always end up trying to guess what's gonna happen next, and you can never figure out what's gonna happen with Freida McFadden. She is just the queen of plot twists. So 5 stars, by far, such a good book. The last one is Gilded by Marissa Meyer. So Marissa Meyer has written a couple of dark fairy tale reimaginings. Fantasy is kind of like the genre that she's known for. Gilded is a dark fantasy retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. This story has romance, it has ghosts, it has demons, it has gifts of magic. It is really, really amazing. I loved this story. It's a little bit, I want to say it's almost like a young adult fantasy, actually. But don't let that deter you from picking up this book. Her world building is amazing. It is following our main character, Serilda. Serilda is blessed by one of the gods in this fantasy realm, and she kind of views this blessing as a curse as well. She's blessed with the gift of storytelling. Let's just put it at that. It's got it all. It's really amazing. I ended up reading both of the books in this series. It's a duology. The second book is not as good as the first book. The first book by far was fantastic. I really liked the dark fairy tale reimagining. I loved the character building, the world building, the background stories for these characters was amazing. So for that reason, I gave it 5 stars. I have read a couple other of Marissa Meyer's books. I've read, like I said, the second book in Gilded, the Gilded series, and then I've also read Heartless by her. So I believe she has a couple of books in a series that is like a dark fairy tale retelling of like Cinderella and a few other like princesses. So really curious to like pick those up and kind of read through those. So that concludes our 5-star reads. I do want to move on to some honorable mentions that I've read through, and these books had some lasting impacts on me. They didn't quite make it 5-star, but I could see these becoming 5-star ratings if I let them sit with me long enough. Maybe I'll go back and change the ratings, but I really enjoyed these books. They made me laugh, they made me cry, they left a really big impression on me. There's a couple that I want to go through. The first is Well Met by Jen DeLuca. This is the first book in a 4-part romance series. This is just a really cute book, you guys. It is a romance story that takes place in this small town, and we're following our main character who is living in this town for a period of time. She's helping out with her sister and her niece, and she gets involved with the local Renaissance fair. It is a Renaissance themed romance story, and it's so unique, you guys. Like, I've never read anything like this before. I think that's what made me realize that I loved it so much, and I gave it like, I think I gave this like a 4.75 or a 4.5 star rating. It's an enemies to lovers trope, which is one that I just froth over an enemies to lovers story, you guys. It gets me every time. So for that reason, this is an honorable mention. It made me laugh, it made me cry. I loved the trope. The writing style was great. I loved the witty banter. And also, who doesn't love like a different type of romance setup, like a Renaissance fair? Like, who thinks of that? That's just amazing. So there's 3 other books in this series. I want to read the other ones as well. I ended up just renting this through the library. So I believe my library also has the other 3, so I need to put those on hold immediately and read through the other ones. The next one is The 7-Year Slip. The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This book has taken the world by storm over the last year. This is like a rom-com with some magical realism elements to it. So we're following Clementine. Clementine inherits her aunt's apartment. Her aunt passes away, which is really traumatic for her. They were very close. They had a really great relationship, and Clementine lives in this apartment, and her aunt has told her a few unusual stories about this apartment of how it can transport you back in time in exactly 7 years. And she encounters this as she is living in this apartment. She is thrown back in time. She meets this unassumed visitor that is living in the apartment 7 years ago, and they form a very unlikely connection, a very unlikely romance, if you will. And it's hilarious. There's some really good banter. The main character, the guy in the story, he is a chef, or an aspiring chef, if you will, in New York City. So it's just charming. It's really cute. It's got a little bit of high stakes to it because of the timing difference. It's like a missed opportunity love. And Clementine doesn't really want to get too involved because she knows that it's not going to last. But that doesn't stop her from looking for this boy in the real day, the real time. And it's a really clever romance trope. I've never read anything like this before. This could end up being a 5-star rating. I think I need to let it sit with me a little bit to see if the trope ends up staying with me long enough. But definitely would recommend this, and that is why it's an honorable mention. The next one that I have is a historical fiction story, which is Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate. This won the historical fiction category on Goodreads in 2017, so this has been out for quite some time, but the amount of research and care that has gone into this story was phenomenal by this author. This is kind of about the orphan train that takes place in the United States in the 1930s. Typically, the 1930s gets a lot of attention around the Great Depression. Later into the 1930s, early 1940s, we are, in the thralls of World War II. The United States gets involved, and this type of background does not get a whole lot of attention. This is based on a true story about these children that are living in poverty and end up being kidnapped and taken and put into orphanages, and then are adopted out to very wealthy families across the United States. There is the mention of this really wealthy woman. I'm trying to remember her name, but she is in charge of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, and it's just so sad. It's tragic. There's definitely an underlying theme of sadness. How could it not be sad? We're following this family of 5 children who is kidnapped and taken to this orphanage, and then each of them are sold off in a way or go through different circumstances that they don't really get reunited with their families. And it could be a real story as we're reading it. So we're kind of getting the past perspective, but also we're getting a present day perspective as well. We're following this lawyer, Avery, and she's trying to piece together her family story. Her grandmother is somehow involved with this plot of being either taken from the orphanage or being involved with the orphan train in some regard. And it's very amazing. The story that is unfolding in here is really tragic and sad, but the ending is just, oh my gosh, the ending broke my heart. It made me cry. So I think I gave this 4.75 stars. I don't know if I'll end up giving this 5 stars or not, just because I didn't really feel like super connected to any of the characters. It didn't really sit with me in that regard, but I do really love this book and would 100% would recommend it. The very last book that is a honorable mention is Best Served Hot by Amanda Elliott, and this is a contemporary romance story centered around 2 characters who are in the food critic industry in New York City, and they are rivals. And I read this so fast, I could not put it down. I'm like cheesing so hard right now just like thinking about this book, because it is pure enemies to lovers, like to the extreme. Like these 2 people like hate each other's guts. Like the one food critic, the girl, is like a social media influencer food critic. She takes photos of food and like all of that, and then the guy ends up working for this paper in New York City who's like old school food critic review. So they have like that against each other. They're like competing against the same job, so they hate each other for that as well. And it's just absolutely hilarious. They're like forced to work together and go to these different restaurant openings and like review the restaurants and the food together, but they absolutely like hate each other's guts, and it's absolutely hilarious. I loved this so much. See, maybe I do need to give this 5 stars just because I'm like cheesing so hard. So definitely would recommend Best Served Hot. It is, if you need a good laugh, definitely would recommend. That concludes today's video. You guys, thank you so much for watching today's video, and if you haven't, comment, like, and subscribe, all of the YouTube things that you guys know how to do. Definitely connect with me on Goodreads. I'm always posting updates on there, what I'm reading, and my reviews, so would love to hear more from you guys on Goodreads. And thanks again so much for watching today's video, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!